William's younger brother Henri Beauclerc, aged 32, was in England at the time. Henry had mostly reconciled with William II in the late 1090s, helping him rule Normandy while Robert Curthose was on crusade. Henry rushed to Winchester, where the royal treasure was at the time, intending to claim the throne for England. The clergymen who were guarding the treasure argued that Robert had a superior claim to the throne as he was older. Henry argued that he was born to William I when he was actually reigning in England, unlike Robert, which gave him entitlement to the crown. Henry had the backing of powerful barons such as Henry and Robert de Beaumont, Earls of Warwick and Leicester, respectively, so Winchester Castle was forced to yield the treasury to him. He was quickly crowned 3 days later by the Bishop of London, as there was no Archbishop of Canterbury present to conduct the traditional service. The now Henry I of England had to assure the country of his good rulership, as his claim had a significant challenge with the existence of his elder brother Robert abroad. He stated that he would be nothing like his elder brother William in his oppression towards the church, and assured the barons that he would not abuse their property rights, which was welcome news to those who despised William II. He also promised peace and stability, something which had not been around since the reign of Edward the Confessor. It seemed that Henry had won over the support of England, but the question was now if he could ensure that Robert, Duke of Normandy, wouldn't invade and insert his own claim to the throne. To bolster his status as the rightful king of England further, he married Matilda, the 20-year-old younger sister of King Edgar of Scotland. Not only did this help soften the constant border disputes with that kingdom, Matilda was the daughter of the late Margaret of Wessex, who was herself a granddaughter of Edmund Ironside, one of the later Anglo-Saxon kings of England. This was a hope of Henry to unite the claims of the old House of Wessex and the new House of Normandy, making a stronger dynastic chain than that of Robert, who was solely the son of William the Conqueror. Indeed, Henry was hoping to revive some cultural aspects of the nearly extinct Anglo-Saxon ascendancy of England. Matilda gave birth to a daughter, also called Matilda in 1102, and a son named William after Henry's father in 1103. Young William was christened as William Adelin, a French variant of the word Etheling, meaning Prince of the Blood, thus reviving yet another Anglo-Saxon custom. Before his ascension to the throne, Henry had fathered several illegitimate children. As was expected, Duke Robert of Normandy was not at all happy with the proceedings in England. Robert returned from crusade in 1101 and was beginning to sow seeds of doubt in some of the Norman nobles that had holdings in England. He promised them more lands if they were to support him in taking England, thus reuniting both Normandy and England as had been under William the Conqueror. Once again, much of the Norman barons wished to not have to worry about appeasing one brother over the other, so he began to mobilize support for a full-scale invasion of England. Henry expected this, mobilizing his forces on the coast of Sussex, right around where his father the Conqueror had originally landed back in 1066. Henry had the full support of the church, and those that owed him money, as he had recalled the banished Archbishop Anselm back to England, who was effective at rhetorically providing much moral support for the king. Robert landed in Portsmouth with a modest force, but were joined by several barons in England who were trying to predict which way the wind would blow for either side. Robert marched towards Winchester, but Henry and his men met up with him near Alton. Remarkably, the two sides agreed to a treaty before any fighting occurred. The terms of the treaty were thus: Robert would recognize his younger brother Henry as King of England, while Henry would give up the lands that he controlled in Normandy. He had acquired those from William II's conquests. Duke Robert and his men eventually left England back to Normandy, but those Anglo-Norman aristocrats that had come to his aid were now to be punished by Henry, notably William de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, who was subsequently banished from England. Henry I would build more castles around England to put down any more potential uprisings in Robert's name. Robert of Normandy, now aged 52, appeared to be finished trying to gain control of England. He was perhaps now focused on supporting his own interest in Normandy. He had finally married. He fell in love with the daughter of Norman Italian-born nobleman, Sibylla of Conversano, en route to his crusade. She had given birth in late 1102 to a boy named William, often called William Clito, Clito being a Latin term roughly translating to a prince of the blood. Robert now had an heir to his domains in Normandy, which hopefully would finally bring security to his holdings. However, this would not last for long. His ever-ambitious younger brother Henry I of England continued to stir up trouble. He had a couple of his illegitimate daughters married to some lesser Norman barons, and he also began promising other nobles lucrative estates in England, making himself more of a friendly figure in the eyes of many in Normandy. Robert now felt surrounded by pro-Henry factions, and in 1104 he was forced to ally with one of Henry's old enemies who was banished from England. This gave Henry an excuse to outwardly state that Robert had violated the treaty made 3 years earlier, a manipulative tactic if there ever was one. Henry invaded Normandy in 1105, claiming that he was there to restore order, but was really just going to aid all of the barons he had bought off against Robert. This invasion was supported by the neighboring fiefdoms of Anjou and Brittany, and the King of France did not intervene. Henry was able to capture the important city of Caen. After a brief respite in the fighting, Henry continued to push further into Normandy, winning a decisive battle at Tichembray, wherein Robert was taken prisoner. After this, Henry marched towards Rouen and declared that he would respect the laws and customs of Normandy, effectively making him the Duke without officially proclaiming himself as such. Robert's 3-year-old son, William Cleo, was given to the care of a pro-Henry Norman baron. It appeared that Henry was attempting to rule Normandy in the name of his young nephew, but of course he had more ambitious plans on the horizon. His brother Robert Curthose would be imprisoned in England for the rest of his life. Despite his somewhat brash and manipulative tactics abroad, back home in England, Henry I was winning over the populace as a whole. He was known as firm but fair, as he dealt harsh judgments but gave many stronger rewards to his friends. He had supported a nice network of young and up-and-coming nobles who were dependent on him, thus stabilizing the country to his liking. Henry had restored many aspects of the old Anglo-Saxon justice system, much to the praise of the native English population, who perhaps felt a bit subjugated by northern French aristocrats who didn't speak their language. A lot of the senior Normans barons resented Henry's affinity for the old English ways, and even mocked his wife Matilda, whose mother was English. The king didn't seem to care for their opinions much anyway, always making sure to please the upstart newer noblemen at their expense. Another faction that Henry seemed to always appease was that of the church. His recalling of Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in the early 1100s after the disastrous feud between said bishop and William II was instrumental in healing relations between secular and ecclesiastical authority. Despite some trivial differences, Henry and Anselm worked together for the common good of the realm and pursued the Gregorian reforms that William had so resisted, thus bringing order and careful administration to the church. Henry I also was able to reform the financial administration, establishing the office of the exchequer to collect revenue directly from the local sheriffs, which increased the overall wealth of the crown. Objectively speaking, it appeared that Henry was doing the best job domestically ruling England since perhaps the days of Edgar the Peaceful. In 1108, King Philip I of France died. He was succeeded by his 27-year-old son, Louis VI of France, known posthumously as Louis the Fat. This new French king wanted to re-centralize France and bring the various vassal states that controlled most of the territory of his kingdom under his control. He demanded that Henry, who was essentially acting as Duke of Normandy in the minority of his nephew William Cleo, pay homage to him for his duchy. This practice was not unprecedented, as all dukes and counts within France were nominally subordinate to the French king, but Henry perhaps felt the intentions of Louis VI were to use him as a puppet ruler as opposed to recognizing Normandy as a sovereign state. Preparing for conflict, both Henry and Louis mobilized their forces and began to cultivate alliances. Henry had a built-in alliance with the nearby county of Blois, as his older sister Adela had married that count and bore him 3 sons, Theobald, Stephen, and Henry, and Theobald had recently taken the reign as the Count of Blois with the death of his father. So with his nephew ruling Blois, it seemed that Henry had a friend in the resistance of the new intrusive French king. However, in 1109, the county of Anjou had been taken over by Fulk V, who was also the Count of Maine. The county of Maine was a fiefdom of the Duchy of Normandy, and Fulk refused to acknowledge Henry as his feudal overlord. This put Anjou on the side of Louis VI. In addition, Robert II, Count of Flanders, Henry I's maternal cousin, sided with the King of France. It seemed that a full-scale feudal war was about to take place in northern France, but the build-up did not pan out exactly as expected. Not this early on, anyway, but it did set the stage for later events. In an attempt to isolate Louis VI further, Henry married his eldest legitimate daughter, Matilda, to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, which created an eastern buffer to the Kingdom of France. Furthermore, in 1110, 8-year-old William Cleo, the nominal ruler of Normandy, fled to Flanders with the help of political dissidents who were on the side of France against Henry. Taking this as an act of betrayal, Henry began styling himself as the Duke of Normandy, which would precipitate further conflicts. Meanwhile, back in Great Britain, several Welsh revolts were occurring in the Norman-controlled South Wales, and the independent kingdoms of Gwynedd and Powys were gaining influence and raiding the western earldoms of England. In addition to these Celtic conflicts, Alexander I, the new King of Scotland, began raiding into northern England, despite him being the brother-in-law of King Henry of England, as was his predecessor Edgar. Henry was able to invade Wales himself in 1114, pacifying the situation and agreeing to a truce with Gwynedd and Powys. He was then able to build more fortifications in southern Wales and the western earldoms of England, and promoting the further colonization of Anglo-Normans into the English-controlled Welsh territories. By 1115, Henry had secured his position as both the King of England and Duke of Normandy, effectively reforming many administrative institutions in both, and more or less securing these domains from outside threats, pacifying the Welsh in Britain and avoiding a full-scale continental war in northern France. He still only had 2 legitimate children, his 13-year-old daughter Matilda, who was ruling as the Holy Roman Empress in modern-day Germany, and his beloved 12-year-old son William Adelin. Henry was strongly looking forward to his son inheriting both England and Normandy as a unification between the two nations, as William Adelin was a great-great-grandson of Anglo-Saxon King Edmund Ironside, finally reconciling the brutal Norman conquest of England in 1066. It all seemed so perfect, but Henry was concerned that if he were to die at this moment, his young son would be eaten alive, particularly in Normandy, where his claim was shaky at best, with the deposed Robert Curthos's son William Cleo at large. Henry had decided to give in to his request of Louis VI of France and submit to him as his vassal, but only if the king would recognize his son as the heir to the Duchy of Normandy. Louis refused, instead stating that William Cleo was the rightful heir, as Cleo was still in Flanders, which was allied with France. This was tantamount to a declaration of war, as Henry began to support his nephew Theobald II, the Count of Blois, who was mounting an offensive against Louis. In response, forces from Anjou and Flanders began to raid into Normandy. By 1118, Henry was fighting a two-front war in his duchy, with his first cousin once removed, Baldwin VII, Count of Flanders, invading from the northeast, and Fulk V, Count of Anjou, invading from the southwest. The situation got slightly better in 1119 when Baldwin VII died in battle, which prompted a succession crisis in Flanders, thus eliminating the northeastern threat. However, Fulk was making huge gains in western Normandy, taking over the important city of Alençon. Remarkably, Henry was able to neutralize this threat as well by enticing Fulk to marry his daughter, Matilda, to the heir apparent William Adelin. Anjou now was an ally to Normandy by this marriage, and Fulk agreed to leave the county of Anjou in Henry's custody while he went to the Holy Land on a crusade. To gain further support from French fiefdoms, he had one of his many illegitimate daughters, Maud, marry Conan III, Duke of Brittany. Now Henry had the clear advantage in northern France, with Flanders neutralized and Anjou and Brittany on his side. Surrounded, Louis the Fat was forced to begin negotiations. By the summer of 1120, Louis agreed to recognize William Adelin as the heir to the Duchy of Normandy over his cousin William Cleo, still hiding in Flanders. This was a triumphant victory for Henry I, as now his 17-year-old son was safe in his future inheritance, ensuring a dynasty of Anglo-Norman supremacy in northern France for the perceivable future. The recent successes in France called for much celebration. Henry was itching to return to England, where he had been absent for quite some time. His wife Matilda of Scotland had died there 2 years earlier, being unable to attend her funeral. A lavish ship was prepared for Henry's crossing the English Channel back to England, but decided to leave this new ship to his son William and other nobles to follow behind. The young Prince William would board the illustrious white ship with his 2 elder paternal half-siblings, Richard of Lincoln and Matilda, Countess of Perche, as well as his 28-year-old cousin, Stephen of Blois, who was instrumental in helping his elder brother Theobald II of Blois ally with Henry in his conflicts in France. Stephen had become ill before the ship was supposed to leave, deciding to stay behind in Normandy for the time being. The king's vessel had already set sail, and this was way ahead of the journey, and the captain was ordered to catch up swiftly. The more than 300 young Anglo-Norman aristocrats were having quite a party, and were seriously inebriated as the white ship set off. The loudness of the party ship could be heard all the way from the king's vessel. Despite the jubilation, tragedy struck very soon after the white ship began its journey. Sailing very quickly in the dark to catch up to Henry I's ship, the vessel struck a rock on the port side of the ship. Almost immediately the ship capsized, and panic ensued. The king's vessel heard their screams, but assumed that it was still joy from the party. There was a small escape boat that William Adelin had gotten into, but he heard cries from his drowning half-sister Matilda and jumped into the sea to save her. By the time his rescue boat had sunk with the panicking masses trying to board it. Everybody on the ship drowned, save for 2 that were able to cling to a rock in the night. When the court informed King Henry about his son's fate, he collapsed with grief. It was said that he never smiled again. His plans for secession were ruined. as now he had no living legitimate sons. Henry scrambled, having quickly remarried to Adeliza of Louvain, a daughter of a Flemish noble, in order to produce another legitimate son. But the death of William Adelin was not only disastrous for Henry's dynastic ambitions, but also diplomatically. Fulk V, Count of Anjou, having returned from crusade, demanded that Henry return his daughter Matilda, who was now the widow of the late William. Because the marriage was the entire fabric of the new alliance between Anjou and Normandy, Fulk broke this commitment and began raiding into Normandy yet again. Even worse, Fulk married another one of his daughters, Sibylla, to William Cleo, who was still in Flanders, trying to gain support to reassert his claim to Normandy and now possibly England, especially with the death of Henry's son. Several Norman nobles revolted against Henry in support of Anjou. Henry set his eldest legitimate son, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, to put down these rebellions and besiege several castles. Many of the leading Norman nobles were destroyed in this hasty reaction. Henry had no more patience. He had to secure his lands now more than ever. He was even able to convince the Pope to annul William Cleo and Sibylla of Anjou's marriage on the grounds of consanguinity. 1120s rolled along. Henry's new wife, Adeliza, was not producing any children. Becoming resigned to the lack of a legitimate male heir, the king began thinking more practically about the future of his domains. William Cleo was in the senior male line of the House of Normandy, being the son of William the Conqueror's eldest son, Robert. However, Henry resented this nephew for his earlier attempts to grab Normandy and side against him with France. Instead, Henry looked at the more amicable nephews, the sons of his elder sister Adela, who he was much closer to. There was Thibault II, Count of Champagne and Blois, a crucial ally to Henry in his wars against Louis VI of France. There was also Stephen of Blois, 2 years younger, who had assisted his elder brother in the same struggle and was close to his late cousin William Adelin. Finally, there was the youngest, Henry, but he was currently the abbot of Glastonbury and was fully committed to the religious life. Henry decided to prefer Stephen, as then it would unite Blois, Champagne, and Normandy in England under one throne. He may have let his nephew know about his plans, and even arranged him to marry Matilda, the wealthy heiress to nearby county of Boulogne. This may not have seemed important, but Matilda's mother, Mary, was the daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and Margaret of Wessex, thus making her too connected to an old Anglo-Saxon legacy, something Henry was excited about with his own son. Also, the possible union of England, Normandy, and Boulogne geographically was more strategic than that with Blois and Champagne. However, Henry's reluctant plans for his new nephew Stephen changed quickly in 1125, when his legitimate daughter Matilda's husband, the Holy Roman Emperor, died without providing her any children. Matilda, who would always be known henceforth as Empress Matilda, was still only 23 years old, and could be further used for her still. In a bold mood, he announced to the Anglo-Norman barons that he would name Matilda as his successor, which caused an uproar. No woman had ever ruled England or Normandy in their own right. However, Henry's idea was to get her married again quickly so she could bear sons herself. Thus she would rule in the name of an up-and-coming young king. But to whom? Henry I wished to quickly reconcile with the ever-powerful Fulk V of Anjou, so he married Matilda to Fulk's heir, the 14-year-old Geoffrey the Handsome, in 1127. This could possibly work out, as Henry's new son-in-law could be the King Consort of England and Duke Consort of Normandy, and unite many of the northern barons of France. Fulk V once again left for the Holy Land, this time to become the titular King of Jerusalem, leaving Geoffrey as the new Count of Anjou, and therefore Matilda as the Countess Consort. With this new system of alliances in northern France, Henry was able to fight against any Franco-Flemish alliance in support of William Cleo's claims to Normandy and England. A new conflict would spill over, as Charles I, Count of Flanders, was murdered with no heirs, leading to another succession crisis in that county. William Cleo would become the new count, a great-grandson of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders. This was backed by the King of France, but Henry did not wish for his enemy nephew to gain this territory. He backed the claims of Theodoric of Lorraine, a maternal grandson of Robert I of Flanders. Henry invaded the French royal domain in 1128, which forced Louis VI of France to cut off support to William. William would shortly thereafter suddenly die childless, which was welcome news to Henry, thus securing Flanders and his ally Theodoric and eliminating the threat of Cleo taking over his territories after he died. Now he could focus solely on promoting his daughter Matilda to be his heir. In the early 1130s, Matilda and her new husband Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, were attempting to raise support in Normandy. The Norman barons had disdain towards Anjou after being at war with them over the years. Geoffrey, now aged 20, was known often as Geoffrey Plantagenet, because he wore a yellow broom shrub, known in Latin as a plantagenista, on his hat. He was not a popular figure in Normandy, and many thought that he was simply trying to seize power there for himself. Matilda was frustrated at the suspicion her own future subjects had towards her and her husband, and appealed to her aging father to help by giving them royal castles. Henry refused, also giving in to the suspicion of Geoffrey Plantagenet. A minor rebellion broke out among some of the Norman nobles against Henry, which Matilda and Geoffrey supported to gain popularity in Normandy. This backfired, as many of the king's supporters in England were getting quite annoyed at Matilda, perhaps already not being excited at being ruled by a female. Nevertheless, Matilda gave birth to her first child in 1133, naming him Henry in honor of her father. 2 more sons, Geoffrey and William, would follow within 3 years. This was welcome news, as now King Henry had grandsons to carry out his legacy should their mother, Matilda, prove to be unpopular. As the absurd rebellion in Normandy went on, Henry was becoming exhausted. He was now 67, and he had conducted a lengthy 35-year reign in which he restored a conquered England to its former glory and consolidated his power in France. He finally died in December 1135 in Normandy, still trying to put down feckless revolts. His death, predictably, led to a total onslaught of confusion and controversy. This concludes this portion of this series. The next video will sort of be about the anarchy that ensued after the death of Henry I and the competing claymates to his throne in England and in Normandy. So I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you then.